Compañeros, welcome to another edition of the SQL Data Partners Podcast. I am Carlos El Chacon, your host. And today we are joined by a very special guest, Mr. Chris Marshall out of St. Louis, Missouri. So welcome, Chris.
Thank you very much, Carlos. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, so Chris grew up around St. Louis, has been in the programming and the DBA business, right? And today he's going to talk to us about verified backups. That's our topic. And so we're excited to have Chris with us. Before we get into that, however, right, we still have Eugene here with us.
Yep.
And
we still have Eugene? I thought we got rid of him
for now. That's waiting for assassins to drop from the ceiling. Yeah.
They're late. That was supposed to happen at 10 after. And Mr. Kevin Fiesel.
Hello.
There we go. Who is moonlighting as, I was going to say a frog, right? But that's not, maybe not quite. Anyway.
I'm working on my smooth jazz voice.
Our show notes for today's episode are going to be at SQLDataPartners.com/verified backups or at SQLDataPartners.com/264, because this, compañeros, is episode 264. And we're just rolling those numbers along. Okay, before we get into our topic today, as always, we have a couple of shout outs. And again, if you happen to make the very small list of names that I misquote, welcome to the club, or mispronounce, and I hope you enjoy residency in this very exclusive club. Okay, here we go. Delwa, Karen, Brandon Leach, Sequel Guy, Jesse Haas, Reyes Emaven, Misinau Dijalau, man, Eli Sandro.
I think you've just given up at this point. You're just throwing out syllables.
Hey, these are real people. I promise you. At least they have real accounts on social media. How about that? John Kursky, Wolfgang Strasser, Pierre Charles, Pan Jade, Muhammad Izuddin, Roderick Walker, Etan Blumen, Lean Tai, Ginger Grant, Devin Knight, James Phillip, Sarah Reyes, and Mehdi Sarafian. There we go. So thanks, compañeros, for giving us a little shout out, right? Interacting with us in some way or another. If there's something that you like about what we're putting out, please let us know. Feedback is always appreciated. And I suppose, right, as you're looking for your new spring wardrobe, SQLDataPartners.com/t-shirt, right? You can get that SQL Data Partners podcast t-shirt, to add to your repertoire for the spring.
Also, legally, you're allowed to wear it any season of the year, not just spring.
That is true. Thank you for pointing that out, Kevin. Okay, so, compañeros, one of the interesting things that I thought about for today, I was chatting with Chris. And we were talking, and we know that our backups are only as good as our restores, right? And that if we can't restore a backup, then the backup is not doing us any favors, particularly when it comes to SQL Server. And I suppose now, right, this is where we'll go around and horror stories, right, around not having backups. Chris, I guess we'll let you jump in first, as you're our guest. Welcome, you get first take.
Thanks for first dibs, Carlos. A company called me in after they had a crypto virus attack. So it wasn't a ransom situation, but it was a specially crafted virus that deleted every file on every machine in their organization. A company with 350 employees. And they started delving into their backups and discovered that their payroll backup, which was SQL-based, had not backed up correctly in 9 months. Nobody knew it. They were getting a happy email every day from their cloud provider, and what it was backing up was 9 months old. And so that was an exciting situation for them because in that state, they had to have complete payroll records. They actually brought management in to make 42,000 manual payroll entries to catch them up. And so a great example of what can happen when you don't know how to check.
Yeah, and I mean, so at least luckily at some point they had that to go back to, right? We had another scenario, again, unfortunately, with the medical records space. Right there, I can't remember if it was probably ransomware. That seems to be a lot of the big guns now. Got it, and they had no way to get back. Everything was taken, right? And so they went to their backups, which were also encrypted, and or didn't happen, whatever. And so luckily they had I shouldn't say luckily, but their situation was they had refreshed their hardware about 18 months ago.
Oh.
And somebody happened to just stick the hard drive of one of the servers into a drawer, right, that they had, and that's what they started building from. And not fun.
So I'll talk about one where I wish I could say it was a client. I was my own client in this case.
Oh no!
Now, an unidentified client, right?
Right. A very handsome person who wishes to remain anonymous. This was early on, very early in my career. I wasn't even a database person at this point. I was a web developer. And it turns out that we weren't really backing up anything, and sort of accidentally wrote an update statement that kind of sort of updated all the rows in a table, and accidentally removed a lot of information that members of agencies across the state had entered over the course of the prior month regarding grant funding that they would receive, and kind of had to say, due to some weird hardware glitch, this goof happened, and unfortunately, it seems that there was no relevant backup except this one, this that I manually took 3 weeks ago. So, would you mind re-entering a bunch of data?
Oh gosh!
You can trust me this time.
That was not when I got Employee of the Quarter. I'll tell you that.
Right. Yeah, that's when you became a senior, though, right? That's once you do that, right? Then you become a senior because now you've crossed onto the I've learned that lesson.
I've become a senior many times over. Then I mean,
yeah, I do maintain you're not a senior DBA until you've dropped a table and then brought it back up. The second part's important because otherwise you're just unemployed.
Yeah. So it is worth mentioning, right, that there could be a number of different reasons, and I think most of us that work with data recognize that there can be a number of pieces, right? So we talked about ransomware, we talked about update statements. So deleting can also be I'll call it missing where clause, right? So the missing where clause has bitten many of people, right, in the in the backside before. Corruption is another one, right, that can get in there and can cause problems. And so the extent to the outage or the data the data that's available can vary, but our ability to recover is still super important. And it is interesting. So Brent Ozar actually had a post on LinkedIn about how restore from a table is still not a feature, even in SQL Server 2022. Sure. And there was kind of an interesting response on Microsoft trying to help people help themselves, and how they thought the restore table function would actually cause more more damage than good, which I thought was a very interesting.
Was it? I think Snowflake can do it, right? Or Postgres. I mean, it's. I don't follow that logic, I guess is what I'll say.
Well, yeah. And if you go back far enough, some of the earlier SQL Server tools could restore. They had table restoration. It was a little hacky the way it was implemented because obviously it wasn't supported within the backup API. But I recall that Redgate's database backup tool, and we're talking, 18 years ago or so. Maybe not that long ago, but pretty long ago, that it was capable of doing this sort of table level restoration, but that the restores could be a little weird in that, again, this isn't fully supported. Now, the issue that you could run into with restore table is that, well, in order to restore this table, we have to think about foreign key constraints. We have to think about, are we going to restore all of the other data associated with it? Are there
Right.
transactions that are currently in process?
And I think that's where people can get into trouble, right? Because even
exactly.
the third parties that I've seen, you're basically recreating that table. Well, that table doesn't exist anymore. You're going to recreate it, and then you got to build everything again. Because I'm just going to shove the insert statements back in, right? So restore is probably a strong word for what we're doing there. But,
Right.
Yeah. So, right, we need to take backups, and there are a number of different options that are available to us, right? We've got SQL Server backups. There are third-party options, right? So sometimes the third-party options can be a little problematic, right? So there's the application aware settings that we know if you go into your log, your SQL Server logs, and you see that IO is frozen on database X, right? You know that you've got something using, VSS, or the volume shadow copy, right? To back up, trying to do those backups of the files, right? I guess, yeah. So in terms of your preferences, Chris, I mean, obviously we're going to talk about your tool, in a second, but in terms of the everyman, I have a SQL Server. In terms of the way they back it up, do you have a preference or any guidance there?
I mean, there's a variety of tools. I like the built-in SQL tools because they're native to the database and they work very well when the database is under load. Yeah, but it's just then the question is what happens with it after that, and how do you know? And that's kind of what I'm all about.
Yeah. So part of the challenge, right, with then doing restores is that so the GUI can do it, but there's always a little bit of
Right.
The first time you restore, particularly to a production environment, and you're not trying to overwrite, right? You're just trying to test the restore. If you don't have a test environment for you to restore to, and you're doing, database _ test restore, for example, there's always that weirdness of like, okay, am I going to mess something up, right, when I try this?
Yeah, you don't want to restore over anything,
right?
In that scenario, and then there's scenarios where somebody's dropped 3 records in a table, and you don't want to restore over the table because perhaps things have been going on since then, but you want to get those records back because maybe it's the customer names and it's got their customer record IDs, and you've got to get those back in place because everything ties into that. So that's a whole nother kind of scenario.
Right. And so part of the challenge, I think, so a couple of the reasons that folks, maybe don't test restores is one, environment space, right? So I don't have a place to do my restores. So then if I do have it, again, if I'm doing some testing or whatever, there's just the process of I need to go over there. I'm now working in different systems, and the SQL Server native tools don't necessarily do super great at like connecting those two environments and being like, oh yeah, you have to know where it is, and obviously if you have access to it, right, you can go and find the backup, right? But it's not perhaps as intuitive as the word I want to use, right? You have to know what you're doing and know where the different pieces are to be able to test those restores.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that.
Yeah. So let's see. In terms of so I guess why backup? So I guess before we move on, then, in terms of how frequently should people be backing up, right? What's your take?
You want to back up in a cadence that represents what you can tolerate to lose. I mean, you're not going to run a backup every 10 minutes of your SQL database, right? But a lot of people will do it daily, and a lot of people will do it every 2 or 3 hours, because if disaster strikes, lightning, fire, whatever, they want to have as small a gap as possible in their recovery time.
There we go. Yeah, so that recovery time. So the question is if you're an incredibly handsome young web developer and you want to email several companies in the state of, some state in the South, how many?
Oh no, it was in the North.
It was in the North. Okay. How many companies do you want to have to email, right? How far back do they want to have to re-enter that data, right? And what's feasible as well, right? Because we know a lot of times there are integrations with different systems, right? So it's not just users keying in stuff. There are imports or nightly jobs that happen, and all of those things are going to play a factor into when I need to take my backups, right? Yeah. Okay, so then, right, one of the reasons we wanted to bring you on, Chris, was to talk a little bit about solving that problem. Now, we've talked about some of the issues that we've had or some of the reasons why we might need a backup, right? Nothing is then worse than actually going to what you think is a backup, restoring it, and corruption is generally going to be the ideal killer here, because you can have corruption in your database, back it up, and it will work just fine. You can even restore those depending on where the corruption is, and again, that's a different, I guess, a different peak there, but or a different concept. But there are lots of considerations in terms of I guess how to get that verification. So sure. Chris, you kind of come up with a way to help people feel better about being able to restore, right? So why don't you walk us through that?
Well, I just think the traditional thing that I see a lot of big companies do is, like, once a year they take all their programmers and they put them in a hotel and they order a lot of pizza, and they make them pretend that the head office has burned down, and they have to take backups that are somewhere and basically reconstruct their data center. And so that's a lot of time and effort and money and pizza. So they do this maybe once a year, or maybe twice a year, right? And so, a test is as good as the time frame. The reason that people service aircraft in between every flight is because they don't want to rely on the guy that was 3 flights back to have done the right thing. So they're always checking, and we're not aware of that, but you kind of know. So I realized if this company that was 9 months out, somehow they had not been testing their backup. I think probably because they didn't know how to, and their MSP wasn't a DBA, so he wasn't really aware of those issues either.
Right.
And I realized, what if we could do more frequent testing? And
I guess you'll forgive me there, but that MSP issue, right, is a big one. So organizations that work with the MSP, right? So SQL Server is a different animal, and I think most of us that work with SQL Server understand this. But to a lot of folks, it can still look like a Word file, right? It's like, hey, I have that document, right? Go and restore that. And unfortunately, right, it's a little more complicated than that. And not just because you are a techie doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to understand how to do that.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, SQL data is stored in a file on a server, and so people can mistake the idea that, I can just run some sort of file copy routine, and I'll have that, or even an image copy.
Right.
So I came around and said, what if we shorten the testing cycle? In fact, what if we set up a way that people can have their SQL backup tested every day? So the longest you'll ever go without testing is 24 hours. And the only way to test, right, we know this, Veeam has done a big study on this. They say the only way that administrators can know a backup is good is to try to recover it. The only way. The only way we know there's air in our spare tire is to put it on our car, right? There's a lot of things in life that you don't know until you try. And so I came up with a process that said, look, if I'm backing up your SQL, Carlos, we'll do a test restore in a different environment 365 days a year. And that, I thought, was something that a lot of people would already be doing, but it turned out not to be the case.
Yeah, for some of the reasons, right? That go ahead, Kevin.
I was just going to reiterate, not at all. That's something that you very rarely see. Usually it's only organizations that have several database administrators and can dedicate focused time to doing these kinds of tasks. It is funny how so often you ask a database administrator, what is the most important thing about your job? That is securing the data, making sure that this data is accessible, available, and is capable of being used when the people who need to use it need it.
Right.
And that includes obviously backups and restoration. And then you ask, when's the last time you verified your backups? Well, I mean, the customer or the somebody called me a month ago and I had to restore a database for them. So that one worked.
Yeah. I think we could go to a SQL administrators conference and make people very uncomfortable by asking that one question.
For sure. Because it's something that we all know that we should do. And it's also something that most of us don't do.
Agreed.
It's eating our vegetables.
So I'm gonna ask a dumb question here, and maybe it's because I, like everyone here, grew up in the age of spinning Rust and all that kind of stuff. But if every day you're doing these test restores, at what scale does it start to become cumbersome, or at what point are you incurring a cost with all the I/O that you're doing? When does is there a point where it starts to become a little bit unfeasible, right?
Well, I've always said that, in my system, which is up and running and doing these backups every day, I can't back up the Department of Defense. I can't back up Boeing. These are entities. These are entities with so much data that number one, they couldn't transfer through the internet to my environment probably in a 24-hour period, and B, they would just overwhelm things. What I find is a lot of organizations sort of in the 200 to 500 employee space may have 50 or 100 gigabytes of data, but not much more than that. And if they did, we would look at special provisions for that. And there's a couple of kind of neat workarounds to the current system that could take place in those situations.
Gotcha.
Yeah, my take there, and again, so maybe this is the wrong way of thinking, but not every database is created equal. And so I also don't necessarily need to necessarily restore every database. Right. So we're Redgate partners. We use Redgate for our monitoring. Redgate has a database. Yes, I'm not saying I want to lose that history, but if it hits the fan and that goes away, okay, then I'll just spin it up again and we'll just keep chugging, right? Like,
yeah, for sure.
There are instances, perhaps particularly if you know that there are, I don't know, I want to say lookup databases, but things that don't get touched quite as often, that aren't the transactional. It's not your ERP, right? It's not your, the banking or where the financial pieces are, that you could go a little bit longer, right? Then those restores, may not have to happen every day, and you can build up that cadence a little bit longer. But the important thing is to at least get in the process or the habit, and as much as you can do to automate some of that stuff, right, would be ideal.
Yeah, and also it doesn't have to necessarily be you restore every backup every day.
Right.
Two other options that are available for organizations, if that's either not tenable or you have some enormous database, which is a challenge. One of them would be, all right, let's take this at, I'll call it statistically significant intervals. This database, which is constantly updating, I have to take daily backups, full backups of it. All right, well, I might test it once every few days, maybe once a week. For something that is either easily rebuildable or that is very small or that is rarely changing, I might test that less frequently.
Yeah.
And that's one approach. Second approach is, let's have arbitrary testing. You know what? I'm the DBA manager. Hey, we have an emergency. Customer database 46 is currently bad. We need to be able to restore it to this test environment. And by this, you get two things. Number one is you're testing that your backup is successful. Number two, you're testing that your database team is able to restore this backup effectively, which is a different question altogether. So you're keeping people's skills sharp. even if that just means knowing where the PowerShell commandlet is to restore this database to this specific time, knowing that the database backups are in the right place that you would expect them, and knowing that they do restore correctly. So there's a couple of different ways that you can take this idea and apply it, even if you feel like I can't do it on a daily cadence for whatever reason.
I think that approach makes a lot of sense, Kevin, if you're an organization with a DBA. If you're an organization that outsources your IT and somebody else sets up your firewalls and your VPNs and your hard drives and blah, 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 there's no, in my experience, I have yet to run into an MSP that really has any kind of strengths in the DBA world. And so to even know how to do what you just said, I think wouldn't be there. And that's a little bit more of my target market, as opposed to, I'm not selling medical equipment to surgeons who do surgery. I'm selling medical equipment to people who, need to check their temperature or something.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
And it's understanding where you are as a customer, where you are as a service provider, and what does work best for the circumstances. So there's menu of options available, and I think it's perfectly reasonable. They're like, hey, if I'm paying Chris's organization to retain my data to take those backups, yeah, I'd love to hear every single backup is tested every single day. I think that's a good selling point.
Right.
If I'm backing them up, I'm hosting it internally, I'm working on it internally, and I've got a team of DBAs dedicated to this, it's still nice to be able to have that automation. And, if you can get to the point where you're testing every restoration of every backup every day, wonderful. If not, at least having those skills in place to say, right now, we got to do this. Right. Especially the right now, we've got to do this, because that's what really happens is, this database went down and everybody's at lunch, get scrambling.
Yep.
Right.
Familiar with that.
Yeah. And now if you are in that boat, right, and so the kind of you need two pieces to make it work. Well, I'm sure there's 1,000 ways to do this, right? But at least in my mind, if you're using the Ola Hallengren scripts for backup, right, the DBA tools has got a nifty restore option where you don't have to know the name of the database. Excuse me, you don't have to know the name of the backup file, because Ola will put on that the date and blah 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 blah, right, all that other stuff on it. So it will just go through recursively, figure out which one is the most recent, grab it, you can repoint it, and it will do that restore for you. Now again, that's another level, because now you're introducing PowerShell into the equation, right? And so it's definitely not for the faint of heart, but for those of you who are do our DBAs and want to start doing your backups or your restore testing, that is, at least in my mind, the easy button option for that, right? Now, another angle is if you work for an MSP, right, and you are an IT organization or you're a smaller shop, and you're like, what, I don't necessarily want to have to manage that piece or be responsible for it, right? Then I think it is nice to know that there are other options for you. And Chris, I know we talked a little bit about this, but just to maybe reiterate it, right? Because one of the questions that I had was, what's the difference between, right, this verified backups? Yikes. What's the difference between like verified backups and something like a Veeam, right? Or I'm forgetting all the other tools. Some of these other backup tools out there, right? What would you do for me that they wouldn't?
Sure. So what the real difference is, all of those companies are excellent. They all have good products, and they all work almost all of the time. I mean, I'm not out to disparage anybody. I am, though, trying to reiterate that things happen and that nothing is 100%, right? I have life insurance because I'm in really good health, and I'm sure I'll be here tomorrow, but I can't say 100%. So I have life insurance. Like, we're talking about an insurance of sorts for your backups. So what we do that's different is Veeam will take the image of the SQL server or the SQL database, whichever, and copy it to a cloud location. Probably works all the time, although their own research shows that 58% of backups are not recoverable. That's Veeam surveying the industry. Now, maybe they made that up and it's self-serving, but they're probably they're probably onto something, right? The percentage of screw-ups is greater than 0. So what we do is we take your SQL backup, we encrypt it with AES 256, transfer it securely to our AWS location with tons of security and penetration testing and all that good stuff. And then in our environment, we do a full restore of your database. So nobody else, and I can say that pretty confidently, is actually restoring your database in their environment. They're copying it. They may be doing a checksum, okay? But they're not doing a restore. And then the second piece is once the scripts have restored the database, they do a date check. So they send you something like this, by email. Dear Carlos, we got your payroll database. Today is Monday the 27th. We see payroll activity through Friday the 24th. And so therefore we know this is current data and this particular backup is recoverable, right? Back to Veeam, you can't know if a particular database backup is recoverable unless you recover it. So we recover it and then we store 30 days to a year of backups in the cloud, encrypted at all times. So that's the quick answer as to what we do differently. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does. And so we mentioned, right, that there are lots of products out there. So in terms of who would be, right, good targets for you, I think you mentioned like 150 to 500 employees. I think that's what you were.
Anywhere up to 500 employees. I've got a client with 3 employees. They just generate a lot of SQL data. And so they're going into their 3rd year of our service. They prepay a year at a time and they're very happy with the whole thing. So somebody that wants sort of a second plan. And this is just an interesting point. I talk to companies and they're like, well, XYZ set up our backup plan. Well, that's great. You want your entire company's future to rest on a plan. That's like a single point of failure. And it doesn't matter what system that is or who the vendor is. That is their single plan. That is their single point of failure. My message is, what if you had somebody else doing a secondary backup on your most important data? So now you have redundancy.
Yeah. Yeah, so I thought this was compelling enough, right? We like to talk about different ways to do things or different ways you can approach this. So, compañeros, if you are in a situation, we know that a lot of developers will listen to this show, trying to get insights into the mind of a database data professional, or to Kevin's head, one of the two, right? Trying to figure out his social media contact information, but. If that is of interest to you, right, then looking into a service like that can give you that level of comfort. I found compelling, right, and it may be of interest to you. Now, and Chris has been kind enough to extend. So, if we haven't made this clear, Chris has as an organization, he has a service, right, called Verified Backups, that will do as he's described, and he is offering us a promotional deal of some kind. Which I'm sure he will let us know about right now. And you can sign up if you so wish. I think we're going to have a link on the show notes page, or I'm not sure if we're using a code. Maybe remind me what we're doing.
So yeah, we can put something on the show notes. The offer would be 10% off of a monthly or annual subscription. So that's a substantial thing. People can use the show notes to reach out to you, Carlos, and I'll get the information from there and we'll get you set up.
Yeah, there we go. So in terms of pricing, right, where do you start at?
We are right now about $79 to $99 a month, depending on data volume. Mm-hmm. So it's super affordable. If you think of a $2 million company, it's less than they spend on employee lunches.
Sure. Right. And that gives you and even if you have another backup solution, right, And we should note, like, this is not necessarily replacing that backup solution. You still need your Word documents backed up, right? Like, you still need, your Outlook email, backed up, things like that. This is going to be specific to SQL Server, and you can go through that process and then understand, or have the satisfaction of knowing that it's been restored and there's been some automation attached to that process.
Yeah, you explained it very well. I should hire you.
Oh yeah. Well, I think it's important, right? I think again, these stories that we've gone through, and there are more that we haven't mentioned. It is painful, right? Particularly in the in the healthcare space that I've kind of had a focus in at one point. It's just really sad to see organizations, and you're talking about doctors, a lot of times family practices, things like that all of a sudden, they're in the business of trying to help people get better, and they have a technology problem that for $100 a month, they wouldn't have to think about. And,
right.
To me, it feels like, just a good public service to at least inform people that there are other options out there, right? It doesn't have to be, quite so complicated.
I mean, I'll be happy if somebody looks at their data backup routine and says, hey, I need to check this more often, because then I feel like we have served that company.
There we go. That's true. That's true. Okay. So very good. So that show notes, let's see, today is going to be at SQLDataPartners.com/verified backups. And let's see, why am I not? Oh, there we go. So you can get the information there. Click on the link or contact us through the page, and we'll get you access to that discount. Okay, so I guess last thoughts or questions, or Chris, about verified backups?
No, I think we've really covered it, and I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Just people should have. We all drive cars with 2 braking systems, right? Like, we live in a world of redundancy. We should do that in our backups too.
There we go. I like it. So, Chris, we would like to induct you into the SQL family portion of the episode. Can we go ahead and do that now?
Absolutely.
So now you mentioned that verified backups does work against SQL Server. You are going to introduce other database technologies here. If you haven't already, I think you were planning to here shortly. But how did you first get started with SQL Server?
So I was in a work situation in 1997 and had been using Access Database, was scaling some things and wanted a more solid storage. And I don't know how it came up, but I ended up with a copy of SQL on my server and just basically taught myself and just loved it from the first.
There we go.
I mean, that sounds terribly geeky, but I loved that product and still do.
Yeah, back when the query analyzer was separate, and you had the back before Management Studio. Yeah, fun times. Okay, now you mentioned you've been in St. Louis for a long time, but what would you do if you had to change careers?
So I think my aunt had it figured out. She did film strips back in the day, and then videos, and then lectures on travel. And so she'd be like, well, I'm going to go to France for a month because I'm doing this video on living the life in the French countryside. And it was all like supported and tax deductible because she was selling these videos. And then later in her career, she'd go on a cruise ship for a month, and she'd like give 3 lectures and get paid and get a free cruise ship with her and her husband. I mean, it's what's not to love about just sort of being a professional traveler.
Oh, man.
So she was a proto-influencer, is what you're saying.
Yeah. I recorded a TikTok at Stonehenge. That's about as close as I can get.
Well, I had my travel. I told Carlos this the other day. September last year, my son and I climbed Kilimanjaro, and there was no TikTok, but we do have some nice photos from the summit.
It's not the same, but yeah.
Yeah. Eugene's like, I think you have a ways to go on your travel.
Yeah, right.
Professional travel.
Not quite influencer level yet, but give it time.
Right, it's got to be monetized first.
I would have to get on TikTok, I guess.
No,
or not.
Don't do it. Don't do it.
No.
It's a trap.
What is one thing that can instantly make your day better?
Any kind of workout. I love running. I've done a bunch of running. You can see medals.
See the medals behind you. Yeah.
I've been going to this place called Orange Theory, which is just an insane cardio workout, but you always come out feeling better. And I really do my best thinking when I'm in the middle of stressing my body. So
interesting. There you go.
Sure.
Now, what's your go-to song when you need to boost your mood?
So y'all can laugh, but High Hopes by Panic at the Disco.
Okay.
Here we go.
I like the beat and I like the message, and hope is like a really powerful force for good. So
there you go. I like it.
Yeah.
Now, I think we may have gotten to this one a little bit, but we talked about the bucket list, right? You mentioned so Kilimanjaro, right, on your bucket list. So I guess, do you have any other bucket list items on the horizon?
Well, it's interesting. I checked earlier today, not coincidental at all to coming on this show. And I had two similar entries, and one was to fly in a fighter jet, because sometimes they let people go in the back of the Blue Angels or whatever.
Sure.
And one was to fly a fighter jet. And you can actually do that in places. They'll get an old F-16 or MiG, and you can kind of do a few turns. And I think that would be the coolest thing. And when you're in IT, you need to do things that attach cool to you.
That's true. Yeah, I was just thinking there's actually a plane museum. I'm not sure how frequently they do it, but they've got a couple of World War II planes that they still fly. Right, kind of one of those things. Like they take you up, you do a lap or two, and then you come back down. But
yeah. So I went parachuting already, so that's off the list. But the fighter jet thing would be cool.
There you go. Sounds cool.
Sounds like it.
Yeah. As long as you don't have to exit by way of parachute, right?
No.
And,
that would diminish the experience.
It would make for a really good story, though.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see. Our last question for you today. Chris, what's your favorite ice cream topping?
So this will be different. We have this place in St. Louis called Ted Drew's Frozen Custard, literally opened in 1929. It's a family-run custard place. And so there, it's not really what's on top, but it's what's stirred in. And so one of my favorites is pistachio, but another one, and you can mix things. So I'll do like strawberry and Heath bar. And it's just mixed all through there, and it's rich and creamy and delicious. And so I don't do a lot of ice cream. I just go to this place, and I take my grandson and different people.
There you go, man.
So I hope that doesn't boot me off the show because it's not actually ice cream. But
no, you're fine. You're fine. I am down with custard. So in Springfield, which is where our connection, how we got our connection was Springfield, Missouri. Andy's is my go-to.
Yep.
There, very, very good custard. So I really enjoy that.
We have that here as well. So
okay, very good.
Yeah.
You need to figure out how to get one in Richmond. Although Bill and I are both glad that they don't have a soft serve place really anywhere near us, because we would visit that much more frequently than we need to.
Yourself, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And there may or may not be soft serve machines in my browser history. Looking at how to get one into the office.
Well, the problem is a soft serve place can be like a tractor beam. It just kind of pulls you in.
Right. That's right. That's right. You get the trance.
Yeah.
Okay, so Chris, we're going to put some information on the show notes, SQLDataPartners.com/verified backups. Again, will be our show notes for today. But if folks want to reach out to you on social media or otherwise, how might they do so?
So on LinkedIn, my LinkedIn is Chris Marshall Verified Backups. It's like Chris_Marshall_verified_backups. I'm not cool enough to be on Twitter. Or just email, as long as you don't spam me, chris@verifiedbackups.com.
There we go. And Mr. Eugene, if when you're not touring Stonehenge, and you're answering, communications, how might folks interact with you?
I don't know if I reply, but yeah, you can find me on Twitter at SQLGene. You can email me, eugene@sqlgene.com. And I have a TikTok, but you probably don't want to see it.
And Mr. Kevin.
So all of my details were in that database, but I accidentally ran the update statement without a where clause, and they're gone.
Oh, man. If only we had verified backups. Man.
There you go.
Okay, compañeros, you can reach me on LinkedIn at Carlos El Chacon. Thanks again for tuning in to today's episode. We always appreciate it. If you, like Chris, want to appear on the episode or have something you want to talk with us about, reach out to us. We'd love to have you. Love to talk about it, particularly if it's around SQL Server 2022. Thanks again for tuning into today's episode, and I'll see you on the SQL Trail. Bye, y'all.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
SQL Data Partners.